Every night on TV, Johnny Carson grinned at his guests, but beyond that smile was nothing but hatred for one influential celebrity. This visitor was free to turn up on the show at any time. His quips were supplied in advance. All of the interviews were pre-written. Carson was unable to refuse. He raged behind closed doors for 30 years, while pretending to like this man. He also ridiculed the visitor's stiff performances to his workers. For years until now, this conflict between the titans of television has remained concealed. Let's get into it. On October 23, 1925, Johnny Carson was born in Corning, Iowa. He has a younger brother and an elder sister. She was raised in a humble household where ambitions were never realized. Johnny's family relocated to Norfolk, Nebraska when he was 8 years old. It was then that his life began to alter in a subtle way. He came over a magic book at a friend's house one day. He was inspired by that novel. He ordered a cheap magic kit by mail and practiced day and night, chasing his family around the house saying, "Pick a card, any card." A handcrafted cape was fashioned for him by his mother. Additionally, Johnny was making $3 per show as the legendary Carsoni at small-town clubs by the time he was 14. The seeds of the performer he would become were sown by those early performances. World War II was in full swing when Johnny turned 18. He enlisted in the U.S. Navy and enrolled in Columbia University's officer training program. He continued to amuse people with his magic shows even while he studied military skills. He later served aboard the USS Pennsylvania. Although the ship had survived Pearl Harbor, it had suffered significant damage prior to Johnny's arrival. He had to decode enemy transmissions as part of his duties, which called for patience and accuracy. His first task, overseeing the disposal of 20 dead seamen, was somber and memorable. Days after he boarded, the war ended, but he continued to serve, boxing in amateur bouts and amassing a stellar record. The Navy Secretary's question about Johnny's future plans was a turning point. The tough secretary grinned and laughed as Johnny did a magic trick for him, and Johnny realized that if he could amuse that man, he could amuse anybody. Carson completed his degree in speech and radio at the University of Nebraska in 3 years after the war thanks to the GI Bill. Writing comedy for radio was the subject of his thesis. He began working at Omaha's WOW AM and WOW TV in 1950. The Squirrel's Nest, his debut television program, included several absurd antics, such as phony pigeon interviews. At night he held church meals for additional cash, often making fun of the very politicians who attended. A fortuitous break came when a politician's wife, who had stock in a Los Angeles station, suggested Johnny for a position in California. Red Skelton soon saw that he was hosting a low-budget television program called Carson's Cellar. Skelton recruited Johnny as a writer, but fate had other intentions. Skelton was injured one evening just before a live performance. Johnny stepped in and dazzled the crowd. All of a sudden, his name was well known throughout the business. Carson relocated to New York City in 1957 to host the game program, Who Do You Trust? There was more to the show than questions and replies. It was about rapid thinking, understanding people, and being amusing on the moment. Every day, Johnny improved. There, he also got to know Ed McMahon, with whom he would collaborate for decades. NBC began searching for a replacement for Jack Paar on The Tonight Show as Carson's notoriety increased. They required someone who was intelligent, humorous, and composed under duress. The obvious choice was Carson. Johnny Carson took over The Tonight Show on October 1, 1962. TV would also never be the same. Carson made his mark on the show right away. His introductory speech was succinct and to the point, with few jokes on the same subject. He composed music, interviews, skits, jokes, and a rhythm that were all perfectly timed. Even when the writers pressed him, he resisted being political because he thought the program should be inclusive. He took a risk in 1972 when he moved the program from New York to Burbank, California. His goal of having simpler access to Hollywood celebrities was accomplished. Careers began to be forged on The Tonight Show. You were set if Johnny liked you. He might never invite you back if he didn't. He has presented more than 4,500 episodes by the time of his retirement in 1992. It had permanently altered the definition of late-night television. Johnny was a different person off stage. He was quiet and somewhat aloof. He didn't greet the audience before to the performance. When the cameras rolled, he thought it maintained the authenticity of the spirit. Behind-the-scenes employee Barbara Meltzer described Carson as reserved and quiet, reserving all of his glitz for the stage. Prior to tapings, meetings were brief. Johnny allowed plenty of space for surprises but wanted to know just enough to keep things going. He loathed commercial interruptions because they interrupted the natural flow of discourse. Occasionally, after a commercial break, a visitor who was engrossed in a captivating narrative would return with a noticeable irritated expression. Johnny handled visitors he didn't like in his own manner. He didn't pretend to chuckle. Johnny would turn to the band rather than carry on the talk if a guest was uninteresting or well prepared. It was an obvious indicator that the visitor had exploded. Legends like Bob Hope were not immune to Johnny's disdain when their performances seemed forced or overly staged. Johnny Carson grinned on camera from 1962 to 1992, but he was secretly frustrated. He was particularly troubled by Bob Hope's influence at NBC. Since 1950, Hope had been a well-known figure at the network. He was so popular that he could appear on The Tonight Show at any time. Hope only needed to pick up the phone, call the appropriate person, and make a reservation if he had anything unique to advertise. Just tell, without waiting or asking. Carson would sigh and mumble, again, whenever Hope's team phoned, even though he detested it but was unable to refuse. Before caving in, Carson's employees began making jokes about providing Hope a permanent dressing room at the studio because things became so terrible. Carson had to give way to Hope despite drawing millions of viewers each night. Half seriously, half jokingly, he would inform his crew that Bob Hope could not be turned down. The partiality wasn't the only issue. It was Hope's attitude about his appearances. Carson cherished genuine dialogue. He loved rapid thinking, humor that flowed readily, stories that seemed true. None of that was done by Hope. He would send his writers ahead of time with a whole screenplay, jokes, questions and replies, all typed down. Everything was set up by the time Hope settled upon the couch. There was no genuine conversation or enjoyable moments. It was stiff. It wasn't real. Sen detested it. Hope refused to deviate from the script in any way. Hope would move through his cue cards as if he were reading a play, but Carson could joke about everything from politics to space. It hurt to see Carson try to make it look normal. According to one author, it was like smiling while watching a guy sink. Behind the scenes, their frustration occasionally boiled over. Hope went too far during Ronald Reagan's first presidential event in January 1981. The headline was going to be Carson. Later, Hope had a minor part. However, Hope gave Carson some handwritten jokes just before the show and said, "Here, perhaps you can use these." "Thanks, but I'm all set," Carson responded with a courteous smile. "Can you believe that guy's nerve?" Carson went to his crew and raged as soon as Hope left. He once requested if he could use Carson's audience's laughter for one of his specials after a fantastic speech that had the audience roaring. Stunned, Carson nodded. A few weeks later, while watching TV with friends, Carson claimed to have heard Ed McMahon's chuckle, which made Hope's cringe-worthy jokes sound better. Carson repeated the story for years following, half smiling, half outraged. Their antagonism wasn't only about personal slights. The old and the new were engaged in combat. Hope represented the 1950s, the radio era, and the original NBC. With his new humor and hipper approach, Carson was the new king. Carson had to utilize a studio that had been constructed for Hope, a $3 million investment in the 1950s, when he relocated The Tonight Show from New York to Burbank. The studio was still Hope's anytime he wanted it, even if it was now Carson's program. Additionally, Hope's specials consistently received higher advertising. When Carson had his own specials, NBC would promote them on The Tonight Show, but they never reciprocated. NBC officials continued to treat Hope like the true star despite Carson's ratings rising. Carson was aware of it. That sting never completely gone away. Carson didn't keep his feelings to himself in private. Carson would make dark jokes with his staff when Hope became older and began making mistakes during live performances. having trouble with his hearing aids, missing cues and mispronouncing lines. He once said during a break, "I want you guys to shoot me if I ever end up like that." Nor was it a single awful night. In private chats he often expressed that feeling. Carson would occasionally do nasty impressions of Hope fumbling with cue cards at home. It was dubbed the Hope Shuffle by staff. The realization of Hope's transformation frightened Carson even more, but it also pained. Carson vowed to never allow himself to age on television after witnessing Hope's clinging to the limelight. That's one key reason why Carson opted to quit while he was still on top in 1992. There was more to the pattern of strained friendships than Hope. Another difficult chapter was Joan Rivers. Carson had found her in the first place. Years before she had blown it on The Tonight Show with Jack Paar. Carson recognized something in her even though her career was on the verge of dying. He encouraged her and booked her. On live TV they referred to her as a star. One of the most well-liked guest hosts on the show, she eventually replaced Carson on a regular basis by 1983. Rivers always thought Carson was the one who gave her a career. The treachery followed. In direct opposition to Carson's time slot, Rivers was given her own late-night show by the then-new Fox network in 1986. Her spouse would even be hired as the producer, they said. Carson was not informed by Rivers. She felt afraid. She was concerned that the transaction might fail. She was also aware that she had been treated unfairly by NBC, which had given her just one-year contracts while giving Carson 2. Even worse, she learned that she was not even being considered by NBC as Carson's potential replacement. Rivers did not inform Carson of the news when it was finally announced. In the trades, he read it. She made an attempt to contact him. However, it was too late. He hung up the phone and didn't talk to her again. Carson banished Rivers from The Tonight Show for life. In contrast to other comedians who quit or launched competing shows, Rivers received no warm farewells or well wishes. He made it apparent to others that he had erased her from the history of the show. Celebrities who appeared on Rivers' most recent program would not be allowed to return to Carson's couch. The warning worked. Rivers' program had trouble. It was dropped by stations. Sponsors withdrew. Fox let Rivers go less than a year later. Her husband, Edgar, committed suicide a few months later. Rivers' plan to break through late at night didn't work out. She tried to mend her relationship with Carson over the following 20 years. In restaurants, she would even approach him to greet him. He wouldn't even give her a glance. She was devastated. Rivers continued to speak well of Carson even after his death in 2005. However, she acknowledged that she thought a portion of his rage stemmed from the fact that she was a woman and that women weren't expected to leave the men who created them. The last time Joan Rivers appeared on The Tonight Show stage was on Jimmy Fallon's debut show in 2014, over 30 years later. "Emotional," she said. She had won the lap. By the time, however, Carson had already left. She was never forgiven by him, and the mentor and protege never again exchanged words. Johnny Carson and Wayne Newton appeared to be close friends in the early 1970s. Newton, sometimes referred to as Mr. Las Vegas, had over 30 appearances on The Tonight Show. Every time he came on, Carson applauded him and joked around cheerfully. Both off and on TV, their friendship appeared to be solid. They both performed at the same venues and went to the same events, making them well-known figures in Las Vegas. Nobody could have predicted that a storm was gradually brewing behind the smiles. In 1980, the real problems began. Carson and Newton were both interested in purchasing the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. Carson believed he had a solid chance, so he and his business partner launched a strong pitch. However, Newton triumphed by making a larger offer. Carson was enraged. According to those close to him, he felt betrayed. He never actually went back to Las Vegas again because he was so distraught. Newton would pay a heavy price for his victory. Carson came to the stage to vent his frustration after losing the hotel. He ridiculed Newton in his speech every night. The nasty remarks made fun of Newton's appearance, his voice, and even implied that he wasn't strong enough. Jokes said that Newton had dubious connections to the criminal underworld. At that time, Carson had a significant impact. After his program attracted millions of viewers, the jokes began seriously harming Newton's reputation. To work things out, Newton attempted contacting Carson, but he never picked up. The damage continued to increase, and the jokes continued. At last, Newton had enough. He barged into Carson's office during a meeting in 1982. He instructed Carson's producer to get out of the room without waiting. Now it was only Newton and Carson in person. Strong and enraged, Newton didn't hesitate. He warned Carson that there would be a fight if the jokes didn't stop right now. Newton wasn't buying Carson's attempt to reassure him that he was still a fan. It was obvious that the jokes would eventually come to an end. Carson stopped making jokes about Newton after that day, but the harm had already been done. Newton didn't return to Carson's program. Even worse, the mob rumors continued to spread. Newton was connected to the Gambino criminal family in a 1986 NBC story. Newton retaliated vigorously, suing NBC and obtaining a judgment of $19 million. However, the court decided there was no malice, so even though he won the lawsuit, he didn't receive any money. According to Newton, money was never a factor. He needed to cleanse his identity. He always thought it all began with Carson's quips. Newton referred to Carson as a mean-spirited person even after his death in 2005, demonstrating that certain scars never go away. Another crazy episode in Carson's life occurred directly in front of the cameras, but Newton and Carson's fight remained largely behind the scenes. When Shelley Winters dumped a drink on Oliver Reed's head during a Tonight Show taping in 1975, it made headlines. Winters was not amenable to Reed's sexist remarks on women's place in the kitchen. After storming off, she returned and threw a whiskey cocktail directly over his head. The audience adored it. It turned into one of the most well-known incidents in the history of late-night television. Winters was noted for her wild interviews. She enjoyed making a fuss. During an interview, she once gave Carson a random shoe and started babbling about an unrelated movie. Carson was unable to speak. Another time, immediately following a vulgar remark, she made a joke about Reed's mustache. She didn't bother to be courteous or keep things tidy. All she needed was a response. That was hardly the type of mayhem Carson liked. He enjoyed being in charge. He could put up with oddball visitors, but the craziness of Winter was too much. She continued taking the topic in unexpected areas during one performance, from strange jokes about Hitler to Betty Davis's tennis balls. Carson continued to strive in vain to turn things around. He was clearly shaken, as seen by his forced grin and brief commercial pauses. Producers acknowledged behind the scenes that Winters was one of the few visitors that really irritated Carson. He generally attempted to nod politely and go on, but with Winters, even that didn't work. No matter what, she would simply keep going. Their arguments revealed a more significant event on late-night television. Carson enjoyed quiet chats and clever jokes. Winters brought emotional performances that were messy. Carson didn't know how to handle women who weren't meek and flirty, she subsequently said. When Winters arrived intoxicated and slurred her words in 1983, their tension peaked, and advertising her autobiography. Carson joked that she had sold enough books for one night and cut the conversation short. Nevertheless, Winters continued to get invitations to return in spite of all the chaos. Over the course of 20 years, she made 18 appearances. The host of The Tomorrow Show, which ran immediately after The Tonight Show, Tom Snyder, and Carson had another significant conflict. Carson's distaste for Snyder was not subtle. He once attacked Snyder without holding back, calling him a no-talent boring and dissecting his manner after a few glasses of wine at Chasen's, a well-known restaurant in Los Angeles. Carson, who also valued wit and fluid back and forth, detested Snyder's tendency to dominate talks and talk non-stop. Carson's desire to please as many people as possible only served to exacerbate his resentment of Snyder's love of controversy and self-promotion. Snyder wasn't simply uninteresting to him, he embodied every flaw of quality television. Conversely, Howard Stern had his own opinions about Johnny Carson, and they weren't particularly positive. Stern stated on his radio broadcast after Carson's passing that he was never a fan, despite his admiration for Carson's legacy on television. Stern frequently discussed Carson's cruel side, claiming that the warmth people saw on TV wasn't the real Carson. He even claimed that Carson had once beaten his first wife at a party. The fact that Carson never invited Stern to go on The Tonight Show, which was a major affront at the time, would have contributed to some of Stern's ire. Nevertheless, it was noted that Stern later adopted many of Carson's strategies, such as working fewer hours as he became more prosperous. Chevy Chase came next. Carson and Chase played poker together for years, but they were always at a disadvantage. Chase made matters worse by openly ridiculing the notion of presenting a program similar to The Tonight Show and declaring that he would never commit to such a thing. Carson, who never tolerated insults, exacted his retribution in a manner unique to him, once stating that Chase was unable to fart spontaneously after eating a baked bean meal. Carson wasn't consulted when Chase eventually got his own late-night program in 1993. Carson also didn't keep his emotions to himself. He informed the media that Chase didn't appear at ease on television and that he didn't believe Chase understood the true difficulty of the position. Carson was correct. It was just 6 weeks until Chase's program fell apart. You could feel the tension through the screen when Chase and Richard Pryor appeared together on Carson's program, even on live television. Carson wasn't very patient with visitors who brought prescribed materials and didn't interact organically. That was what made Bob Hope famous, providing lengthy, awkward highlight reels that annoyed Carson. Carson didn't enjoy being used like a joke-setting prop. Carson probably felt the same way about Frank Sinatra Jr., who came across as stiff and overly prepared. Carson preferred genuine dialogue over staged acts. Carson's personal life was much more difficult behind the scenes. He had 4 marriages. His first 3 marriages were all unhappy. Carson's envy was stoked by his first wife, Jody Wolcott, who flirted with other men and partied shamelessly until their 1963 divorce. Joanne Copeland, his second wife, claimed that he was extremely angry with women and would occasionally pull the bed linens off the bed to wake her up while she was sleeping, shouting about how hard he worked. Carson's heaviest drinking periods were a time of terror in his third marriage to Joanna Holland. Carson ultimately paid a hefty price for all of these splits, including a staggering $35 million settlement and lifelong payments to one ex-wife. He didn't appear to find serenity until he married Alexis Mayes at age 61. Nevertheless, Carson jokingly said that it would be like receiving navigational instruction from the Titanic captain if you were to take his counsel on marriage. When his 39-year-old son Richard perished in a horrific car accident in 1991, after his vehicle slid down a steep slope, it was the hardest blow to his life. When it occurred, Richard was photographing the shoreline. Carson was clearly shattered when he made his way back to The Tonight Show. He thanked the crowd for their generosity while fighting back tears and displaying private pictures of his kid. He claimed that newspapers had only featured Richard's driver's license photo and that he wanted people to know his true identity. Carson's sorrow revealed his profound remorse for his estranged connection with his 3 boys, which had been concealed for years. Even close friends of Carson, the most well-known TV personality in America, admitted that he felt quite uneasy in social situations. Carson was the most bashful person Dick Cavett had ever met in real life. Since he was a little boy, Carson had occasionally used magic tricks as a shield at gatherings. He used to give journalists little cards with pre-written responses like yes, no and kumquats, since he detested interviews so much. For 15 years, a filmmaker approached Carson to request permission to shoot a documentary on him, but Carson consistently refused, arguing that The Tonight Show should do the talking. And further hidden storm was Carson's drinking. He acknowledged that drinking made him a chilly, angry and occasionally aggressive person instead of a fun-loving one. Living with him was described as a nightmare by his second wife, and according to pals, he could change his demeanor from kind to ferocious in an instant. They thought that Carson's tense connection with his emotionally distant mother, who never took pride in him, contributed to some of his drinking. Some claimed that despite his wealth and popularity, Carson was among the most unhappy persons they had ever encountered. Carson didn't prolong his retirement in 1992. While he was still at the top, he knew he wanted to get out. He made the announcement a year in advance and said them farewell in a straightforward yet sincere manner. He almost vanished from public life after his last performance. He traveled, learned Swahili for safaris, and had exclusive meals with a select group of friends while Alexis Manis accompanied him. The attention was not lost on Carson. He had always kept to himself. At last, he was able to live that way. Television history was made on the evening of his last Tonight Show. Carson chose to keep it low-key and intimate rather than inviting a large number of famous people. More than 55 million people watched. The night before, when Bette Midler performed One for My Baby, Carson broke down in tears, making it the most poignant moment, an uncommon moment of vulnerability that was immortalized on film. He thanked his audience in a heartbreaking voice on his final night, sitting by himself on a stool, and said he was fortunate to be doing what he loved. He concluded with a brief but sincere farewell. "I sincerely hope you have a pleasant night." After 30 years of dominating late-night television, Johnny Carson quit, and he never came back. Behind the jokes and the celebrity was a guy who struggled with loss, loneliness, and rage, and who, even in his final days, remained a mystery to those who loved him.